In this lecture, we're going to see how we can debug our C++ program using the Visual Studio Code editor we have been using all along. The program we're going to be debugging is nothing new. It is what we have seen all along here. And we are basically going to be watching it as it calls the sum function here and give us the result that we can print using this stdcout statement here. What is basically going to happen is when we call the sum function here, its activation record is going to be put to the top of the stack. And now we're going to have the local variables in the sum functions here active. We're going to compute our results here. We're going to add up x and y here, and we're going to get a 22. After that, we're going to call the adjust function here. If we call this function, the sum function here is going to freeze, and control is going to pass into the body of the adjust function as we see here. If the adjust function is active, its activation record is going to be to the top of the call stack, and the local variables in the adjust function here are going to be active. So we're going to have the adjustment variable here. We're going to initialize that to 2. We're going to do a compound assignment to the input variable, which is really a reference to the result variable here. And we're going to add a 2 to it. And we're going to change this to be a 24 because 22 plus 2 is 24. But this value is also going to be reflected in the result variable. And we're going to change whatever we had in there to a 24. I really want you to see this. And once the adjust function is done, it's going to return, it's going to be popped off the top of the stack. The sum function is going to become active, and we're going to execute the statement after the adjust function here, and the sum function is going to return. Once the sum function returns, it is going to return 24 to the main function here, and we're going to assign our 24 to the summation variable here, and we're going to print it, and we should see a 24 printed out here. This is how we expect things to work if the sum function is called in this program as we see here. And we're going to watch this entire process using a debugger. Okay, once we run our program in the debugger, we're going to have the ability to watch the local variables in the active function. We're going to have the call stack. But another thing we will be able to do is to watch some expressions. And by watching some expression, what we really mean is, for example, here, we might be interested in watching the cases where the sum variable here is greater than 10. And we can put an expression summation greater than 10 in our watch window. And at any point in our debugging session, we can see if this expression is true or not. I realize this may be cryptic so far, but once we hit the debugger in a minute, you're going to see that this is really easy and it can come in really handy as you are debugging your C++ applications. Okay, we are going to be using Visual Studio Code here, and there is some setup we need to do before we are able to use the debuggers that we want to use. And for that, we're going to consult the documentation a little bit. Don't worry, it is nothing complicated, and you're going to see that you can get this done pretty quickly. What we will need to set up is a run and debug configuration file. And that file is called launch.json in Visual Studio Code. Because we want to be using two different tools to do our debugging, we will have to put in two configurations. And what you see here is a configuration for using the debug tools that come with GCC. It is nothing to really be afraid of here. I realize this is a lot of text, but don't really be afraid. It is nothing complicated. Here we have a few lines that I think deserve some attention here. We will need to specify which program we want to debug. And our programs in this course are called rooster.exe. If you are not on Windows, it should be called something like rooster or whatever. Just put the name of the executable that we have been generating all along here, and the debugger is going to pick it up and debug this program here. This is the first thing I want you to notice. The second thing is that we have to put in a setting here to open an external console window in which we can see output. Because if you don't do that, this can be really confusing, and I think this is going to make it easier as we are learning. Once you have this mastered, you can then go on and do some crazy configuration to have the output blended into Visual Studio Code, or you can really do this however you want. Next, we will need to specify the debugger that we want to use to debug our applications. The debugger that comes with GCC is called GDB. You can actually see that here, gdb.exe, and we're going to specify where it is. This is going to be automatically picked up by Visual Studio Code. We won't really need to set it up, but you need to be aware of the debugger that you are using. It is GDB here. After that, the last thing I want you to notice is that this is going to use our pre-launch task, which is the GCC task that we set up. This is going to be used to build our binary and then hand it over to the debugger to be debugged, and we're going to be able to do all kinds of crazy things here. And this is the setup you need to do. Once this is done, you will be on your merry way and be debugging C++ applications in Visual Studio Code in no time. Another thing I want you to look at is that we can also set up a configuration to debug using the debugging tools that come with the compiler from Microsoft. And here you see we have almost the same settings. We have the program we want to debug. We will specify it here. We have our setup for the console. We will specify that we want an external terminal, and we will specify our pre-launch task. One thing I want you to be aware of is that Visual Studio Code doesn't make it easy to configure multiple configurations for your debugging, but we will see that we can paste in this configuration and be on our merry way and be debugging in no time. This is really all we are up against. Now we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and actually do this. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is debugging in VS Code. We're going to grab our template files here and put them in place. So let's do that. We're going to say debugging in VS Code. And once we have this, we want to open Visual Studio Code in a special way. We have to make sure we are using the developer terminal that comes with Visual Studio Compiler, because we want to also use that to do things. So I am going to say developer, and I am going to have either a command prompt or a shell. I am going to use the developer shell for my version of Visual Studio I have here. And I am going to change to the location where I have Visual Studio Code installed. So I'm going to go up a little bit, bear with me, and I'm going to cd into Visual Studio Code. It is installed on my C drive. I am going to cd into the Microsoft Visual Studio Code folder here, and I am going to run my Visual Studio Code instance. I'm going to put a dot, a backslash, and say cod.exe. This is the syntax expected by our PowerShell program here, and we're going to run this. This is going to open Visual Studio Code with whatever last project I had in. We're going to close this because we're really not interested in that. What we're going to open is our current working folder. That's going to be debugging in VS Code. We're going to open this little guy and drag and drop in Visual Studio Code here. This is going to open our project, and you're going to see we're going to have in our files here, we have our tasks.json file, we have the program we would want to debug, and this is what we want. The first thing we want to do is to put in the program we want to debug, because this is a template program here. I am going to grab the program we want to debug and put that in here, and you see that it is what we have seen in the slides, and what we want to see is what happens when the sum function here is called. We're going to see all this function here pushed to the top of the stack, and at the end we're going to have the return value assigned to summation here, and we're going to print this out, and we can follow all these things using the debugger. The first thing you want to do is to set up a breakpoint. So we're going to set up a breakpoint on line 13 here by coming to the left here and clicking. We're going to see a red button like this. This is going to be our breakpoint. Now that we have the breakpoint, we want to set up our debuggers. Before we set up the debuggers, I want you to come to the extensions menu here and click on the C and C++ extension here. And this is going to give us a few pieces of information we can use to set up our things. We're going to click on GCC and MinGW here. This is going to open up in our browser. And we're going to come back in Visual Studio Code and click on Microsoft C++ compiler. The first thing we want to set up is using GCC, and if you go down, you're going to see a few instructions on how you can really do this. Let's go down and see that we can find that. We can see the section here on debugging, debug hello world. You're going to find instructions on how you can set up a debugger in your Visual Studio Code instance. From the main menu, we're going to come to Run, choose Add Configuration. We're going to choose C++ GDB, LLDB. This is going to be the debugging tool that comes with GCC, and that's going to add a configuration to build using our GDB compiler. Let's do that. So we're going to come back here to our program. We're going to go back to the menu here where we see our file. We're going to hit Run and do Add Configuration. We're going to see a few configurations we can choose. We can choose C++ using GDB. We can choose C++ using Windows. For this case, we're going to choose C++ GDB. And we're going to have a few options here. We're going to have the option to use G++ build and debug file here. This is what we're going to use. So I am going to choose this. And what this is going to do is try and debug our program by default. But the default settings don't really work for us because we have changed the name of our program here. What we're going to do is to cancel out of this. And if you go back to our file icon here, you're going to see that we have a new file in our .vs code folder, and that file is called launch.json here, and it is opened. This is what is going to contain the configurations for debugging our C++ programs using the GDB debugger. You see that the settings have really been put in here, and we just have to adjust them a little bit. The first thing we want to do is to put in the right program we want to debug. Right here, you see that it is saying .exe here. This is really not what we want. We want to debug the rooster.exe binary that's been generated using our task here. So we're going to go back in our tasks.json file. Let's open that up. And we're going to find the path to our rooster.exe binary here. We can copy it. So we're going to grab this thing that says $file name / rooster.exe. We're going to grab this. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to close my tasks.json file. I don't need that anymore. And I'm going to put that in the place of program here. I'm going to remove whatever I had within this double quotes here. And I'm going to put in my new name, which says $filedir_name / rooster.exe. This is going to be the program we want to debug using GDB with this configuration name here. Okay, now that we have this, you see that we have a squiggly line on this console line. We need to put in proper syntax. And this is no longer recommended to use like this by the time I am recording this video. If we go back to the slides here, you see that to really have an external console, we're going to have to use this command here. We're going to say external console and give this guy a value of true. And I know this because I went through the trouble of reading the documentation, and that's how I know that we have to do things this way. If you have a problem, please do ask. I will do the best I can to help you out. Okay, now that we know this, let's head over to Visual Studio Code and fix our configuration. We're going to say external console and set that to true. Okay, so we are back here. We're going to say external console and we're going to set this to true. So we're going to take out all this thing all together and we're going to set this little guy to true. And this is going to be valid, acceptable syntax in our configuration here. Okay, we have our program name in. We have our external configuration, we have our external console configuration in, we have the debugger in, we have our pre-launch task in. This should really take care of setting up a debugger that's going to be using the debugging tools that come with GCC. And we know this is going to work because we can close our launch.json here and come back to this tab that says run. And if we click on it, we're going to see that our configuration has been picked up. We can click on this down arrow here and see the configurations that we have. And this is what we're going to use to debug our programs. But we don't want to do this just yet. We want to set up a configuration to debug with the debugging tools that come with the C++ compiler from Microsoft. If we go back to our documentation here, you see we have a link that says how we can set up things with the Microsoft C++ compiler. And again, if we go down, we're going to see how we can set up a debugger. Okay, let's go down and find the link. You see debug hello world, and they basically say the same things. But the problem with Visual Studio Code is that if we try to come to run here and say add configuration, we're going to have menus that don't really give us what we want. What we want is to add a configuration like we have done here. And if we choose any of those options, we're going to have other things we don't really want to be dealing with now. So what I am going to do, I am going to come to the documentation here, and I am going to grab the configuration they are using, and I am going to paste this in my launch.json file. So let's grab this and make sure you copy from the starting curly brace here to the ending curly brace, and we're going to copy this. Once we have this, we're going to come back in Visual Studio Code here in our launch.json file. We're going to go down, put a comma, and we're going to paste in our new things we got from the documentation. This is going to be a configuration that is going to use the compiler from Microsoft. You see CL here .exe, and this is going to say the type of debugging we will do. What we want to change here are a few things. We're going to grab the path to the binary that we would want to be debugging, and we're going to put that in. We're going to copy that, and we're going to update our program setting here. We're going to remove everything we had in there, and we're going to paste this in. And another thing we want to really change is the console setting here. You see it is saying external console false. If we come back to our slides, you're going to see that I have a few settings that I have used and have worked for me. And again, I know this because I went through the documentation and tried to find something that really works. So there we're going to say console, and we're going to set this to external terminal. And after that, we will need to set up the pre-launch task we want to use to build our binary. And we're going to be using the one that builds with MSVC. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and say console external terminal. Okay, so here we are in our launch.json file. We're going to say console, and we're going to say external terminal in double quotes here. So we're going to say that here. You see that it is an option. We're going to choose it. And now we almost have this done. The last thing we want to do is to set up the task we want to use to build our program. And that's going to be the task that builds with the compiler from Microsoft. We're going to open up our tasks.json file, and we're going to grab the name for that task, and that's going to be build with MSVC. We're going to grab this, and we're going to copy, and now we're going to come back to our launch.json file and say that here. Okay, once we have these settings in, we are really ready to debug our program, either using the debugging tools that come with the GCC compiler or the debugging tools that come with the compiler from Microsoft. And we know this is going to work because if we come back to our Run tab here, now we're going to have the two compilers detected. We have one using GCC, and we have the one using the compiler from Microsoft. Now that we have this, we can really start our debugging process. To debug your program, again, you have to have in your breakpoint here, we're going to be using the debugging tools that come with the GCC compiler. And to debug, you can either come to the Run menu here and say Start Debugging, or hit the F5 button here. Another way to do this is to come to this Run tab and choose whatever setting you want to use. Here we have the G++ compiler selected, or the debugging tools that come with it. We can click on this green button, which is what I really like to do. And this is going to start the process of building your binary. Once the build is done, the executable is going to be passed into the debugger, and the debugger is going to run your program, and we're going to hit this breakpoint here. Watch this happen. I am going to minimize my instance of Visual Studio Code here so that you can see the terminal that pops up. We have set this up, so we should really see this. We're going to hit the green button here, Start Debugging. You're going to see our debugging process start. You see we have hit the breakpoint here. We have a yellow shape around this, and you see that we have a terminal window which is going to give us the output. We're going to put this to the right here and minimize it a little bit. And I just want you to familiarize yourself with what we see here. Now that we have hit the breakpoint here, on the left you see we have a few windows. We have a locals window, which is going to give us the local variables we have in the main function here. You see we have A, and you see the value of that. We have B, you see the value of that. We have the summation variable, which is going to be initialized to 0. We haven't gave it a value yet, so it's going to have 0. And you see argc and argv, which are used to give input to this program here, but we're really not interested in this. Down here, you see that we have the watch window, and in here, you can set up variables that you want to watch. I have one added in here beforehand, but we can remove that and show you that, for example, we can watch the expression that checks whether the summation variable here is greater than 10. Let's do that. We're going to hover on top of the watch window here, and we're going to have the plus button here. If we click on it, we're going to have a window in which we can type our expression to watch for. We're going to say summation greater than 10, and that's going to be what we are watching for. You see that by now, this guy is false, because the value in summation is 0, so it's not greater than 10. This expression evaluates to false here. Another thing you can see is the call stack window here. This is going to show our call stack, and you see now that on the call stack, we only have the main function. You can see that here, main. This is what is to the top of the call stack. Now that we have these things, another thing I want you to see is the buttons we have on top here. This can be used to move around and execute instructions. For example, the most important button in this case here is the step into button, which is going to be moving us to the next instruction. It's going to step into functions and let it execute other functions. It's going to be pretty cool. But besides this, we also have the step out button. We have the restart button, which is going to restart our debugging session if we want to do that. And we have another button which can stop debugging altogether. So for example, if we click on this red button, we're going to stop debugging. You see that the window went away and we are basically not debugging anymore. But we can start debugging again by hitting the green button here. So let's do that. The debug session is going to start. And we're going to have our terminal window here where we can see our output. Let's put this back in place and make sure you really see this. Okay, now that we have all these things explained, what we want to do is to watch the sum function here called. And we're going to see the call stack here update. We're going to see local variables change here as we activate other functions. And we're going to see all kinds of crazy things really. Let's start doing this. We are on this line here, 13. We're going to hit the step into button, and this is going to step into the sum function here. Watch what happens on the local variables here and on the call stack here. I am going to click this button. Once we hit that button, you see that we fall into the sum function. The local variables have changed. Now the local variables we have are for the sum function. And if we go in the call stack here, you see that the sum function now is to the top of the stack. It is the active function, and the local variables we see are for that function here. If we hit next now, we're going to execute this statement and we're going to say x plus y. That's going to give us 22 because that's what we have in here. And 22 is going to be assigned in the result here. And we're going to see that update in our locals here. Let's do that. We executed that line. Result has been updated to be 22. Now we should call the adjust function and do whatever it is we want to do with it. We're going to hit next. That's going to activate the adjust function. The sum function is no longer going to be active. We're going to have the adjust function to the top of the stack, and the locals are going to update to have the local variables in adjust here. Let's do that. We're going to hit next. You see, we fall in the adjust function here, and adjustment is initialized to 0. Input is 22 because that's what we passed by reference here. And if we hit next, we're going to initialize our adjustment here. Okay, I clicked the step out button and it immediately took me out of the adjust function here. Let's stop debugging and quickly come back to where we were so that we can really move on with this. I am going to stop debugging. I am going to start debugging again by hitting the green button here. And I am going to move this a little bit to the right. like we did. Sorry for this, but this happens. We are developers, so we are not afraid of problems. I am going to hit next, next, next until we hit the point where we were. You see, if we hit next here, this is going to initialize our adjustment variable. You see now it contains a value of 2. Now, if we execute this line, I want you to see what happens. In the input here, you see that we have 22, but input is really a reference to a variable that we have in the sum function. So if we change input here, the changes are going to be seen by this result variable we have in the sum function. And the compiler is going to make sure that this is the case. Let's hit next and see input change to 24 because we just added 2 to it. And now the adjust function is about to die. If we hit next, we're going to return from it and control is going to come back to the sum function because that's going to be the active function. Sum is going to be to the top of the stack and the local variables are going to change to be the local variables we have in sum here. Let's hit next. You see that this is exactly what happens. We came back in the sum function and we are at the statement just after the call to the adjust function. Now we are going to return result, which should be 24 by now. And if we hit next, we're going to hit the end of the sum function. We're going to hit next again, and we're going to come back to the main function here. You see the locals have been updated. Now summation is 24, and watch what we have in our watch window here. Now the expression summation greater than 0 has updated to true because the value we have in summation is now greater than 10. And you can use watch windows to really do all kinds of crazy things and put expressions that help you debug your application better. Okay, now that we are here, we can hit next and see the summation variable here printed out. Again, the sum function run and it returned 24 and we assigned 24 to our summation variable here. Now we can print this summation variable by hitting next. If we do that, you see that we print sum. I don't know if you can see that here. Let's hide Visual Studio Code a little bit so that you can really see what is happening. If we hit next again, you're going to see 24 printed out. And if we hit next, we're going to hit the end of the main function and we are done debugging our application. And this is really how you can debug your applications using the debugging tools that come with the GCC compiler. Okay, now that we have finished debugging our application, we can stop all the debugging process here. You see the terminal is going to die. And I am going to show you that you can really do the same using the debugging tools that come with the compiler from Microsoft. And now that we have all these things set up in our launch.json file, we can just come here and select this down arrow button and choose to use the configuration that is going to use the debugging tools from the C++ compiler from Microsoft. Now that we have this selected, we can start debugging like we have been doing with the other debugging tools. We're going to hit the green button here to start debugging. So it is going to start debugging. We're going to have our terminal window here. So let's do that. And you see that now that we are using other tools, the syntax is a little different here in the call stack. But the information is really the same. The main function, as you see here, is to the top of the stack. And it is the active function, and we're going to have the local variables for the main function here. And you see that compilers really have different behaviors. With the GDB debugger, we saw that summation was initialized to 0, but you see here it is initialized to a junk value. Okay, if we use the step into button to call the sum function here, let's do that. We're going to jump into the sum function. The sum function is now going to be to the top of the stack. We're going to have our locals for the sum function active. And if we just jump in here, we're going to start doing things. Now we're going to execute the statement to store the value in our result value. So we're going to execute this guy. You see that now result is 22. We're going to call the adjust function by hitting the step into button here. We're going to jump into this function. Now we're going to initialize adjustment. You see it is 2 here. And if we execute this other statement, we're going to change input to 22, and the changes are going to be visible in this result variable here because it is passed by reference. And notice which function we have to the top of the stack, adjust, and the locals are for the adjust function here. The same things we really saw with the GDB debugger. If we hit next, we're going to finish executing adjust. and we're going to pop it off the top of the stack. And now sum is going to be the active function. Let's do that. You see, sum is the active function. We can hit next to go to the next line. If we hit this statement here, we're going to hit the end of the sum function. If we hit next again, we're going to come back in the main function. We're going to have our variable, and we're going to have the return value of sum assigned to our summation variable here. Let's do that, and you're going to see that the moment we do that, summation is going to be 24. Our watch window is going to say true here because now summation is greater than 10, and we can move to the next line and really print things out. You see now that we have jumped into the logic to print stuff using stdc out. We don't really want to do that, so here we're just going to step out. Okay, you're going to see that we say sum here, and if we step over, we want to step over all this crazy logic to print with stdc out, and we just want to see the result of that. For that, we're going to use the step over button here, and if we do that, you're going to see our value printed out, and we're going to hit the return statement here, which is basically going to end the main function. And now if we hit end here, Visual Studio Code is not going to be able to terminate the program properly, but we can end our debugging session by clicking the red button here, and you see that it ends, and we can hit enter to close this window here. This is really how you can debug your C++ applications using the Visual Studio Code editor. We have the option to use the two configurations we used in our launch.json file. We can use the debugging tools that come with GCC. We have those configured here. Or we can even use the debugging tools that come with the compiler from Microsoft. This is really all we set out to do in this lecture. Hopefully you found it interesting. We are going to stop here in this one. In the next one, we're going to show you how you can debug your C++ applications through the CodeLight IDE. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.